Ireland has been identified as the Achilles heel in European security. With limited capabilities, the Irish rely on an unspoken agreement with the UK for airspace defence and its own small naval presence to protect their borders and coastline. But as global tensions reach its shores and skies, how can Ireland improve its military capacity and still remain neutral? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Ireland has a long and proud history of neutrality, though its soldiers have made significant contributions to UN peacekeeping in Africa and the Middle East. However, the Irish military is modest compared to its EU allies and requires significant improvements. This year, the Irish government set a record $1.5 billion budget for more personnel and modernisation. But with such an ambitious timeline and a history of underfunding, how likely is Ireland to reach its goals?
Known as the Emerald Isle for its picturesque coastlines and rugged terrain, Ireland is one of a handful of EU countries to have a policy of neutrality.
BSG 05.
It's not a NATO member, with its troops only used in peacekeeping and crisis management operations. But as geo-instability increases across Europe and defence technology advances, being militarily neutral may no longer guarantee safety. Some recent warnings include the US seizure of a Russian tanker near Irish waters earlier this month, and unidentified drones seen at Dublin Airport on the day President Zelensky arrived in December. With Ireland taking the EU presidency in July, it faces increased scrutiny over its defence.
We are focusing on is the expansion and the development of a new radar system. This will be developed in the coming years out to 2028, which will give us enhanced capabilities and capacity.
Bolstering Ireland's defence is a huge challenge. After decades of relying on the UK, Ireland has the EU's smallest military. Its force of 7,500 active personnel is less than half the size of both Denmark and Finland's forces, despite their similar populations. Only 2 of its 8 Navy ships can be deployed at once, and it remains one of the few European nations with no fighter jets. The government aims to modernise Ireland's armed forces by 2030, investing in new radar and sonar systems, helicopters and advanced anti-drone systems. It's also on a recruitment drive, last year spending more than $2 million on social media advertising to attract new personnel. After years of underinvestment and relying on the UK, will Ireland really be able to close the gap in its defence?
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Madrid, we have Fabrice Pothier. He is CEO of the geopolitical advisory firm Rasmussen Global and a former NATO Director of Policy Planning. In Oxford, in England, we have Frank Ledwidge. Frank is a senior lecturer in strategy and law. That's at Portsmouth University. He's also a former military intelligence officer. In Cork, in Ireland, Vice Admiral Mark Mellett. He's a retired Irish naval serviceman and former Chief of Staff of Ireland's Defence Forces. And in Dublin, the Irish capital, we have Francis Fitzgerald, former member of the European Parliament for Ireland and the former Deputy Prime Minister or Taoiseach of Ireland. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Frank, I'll come to you first. Just tell me how worried you are about Ireland's comparative lack of defence capability.
Well, look, Ireland dominates the north-west approaches to Europe and has been for a number of decades now the weak link. If you just look by way of comparison, you've got a nation of 5 million people on the other end of Europe with 5 times, or 6 times actually, the defence budget, can put out a force of 250,000 men, a very capable air force and something of a navy on a threat to its eastern flank. On NATO's western flank, you have Ireland, with a minimal defence budget, highly capable people in the defence forces, but very, very little capability, which has had, and I'll put this charitably, a benign reliance on its rather powerful neighbour, whom I think, as a British officer or former British officer, I can say is treated as an afterthought in its defence. And my argument and my view would be that it's about time that some sense was applied to this, and we started to develop a common approach. That applies to the British and the Irish.
Thanks, Frank. Let's bring in Fabrice. Fabrice, give us the European view then. Is Ireland really Europe's Achilles heel?
Well, I think what is clear is that in this new threat environment, especially with an expansionist Russia, and now increasingly, sadly, also a United States with expansionist visions, neutrality doesn't buy you security anymore. So I think this is the conundrum that Ireland is facing: is how to be safe, but at the same time, that will mean a rethink of its neutral status, and which also includes defense spending that has to quite dramatically increase.
Francis, to you in Dublin, what do you say when you hear criticism of Ireland not spending enough on defence then and being a weak link in Western Europe?
Well, I recognize very much why people would say that, actually. You have to understand the historic origins of neutrality in Ireland. We didn't want to get pulled into UK colonial wars, and obviously, with the north of Ireland to consider as well. So the origins were kind of understandable. And then we moved very much into peacekeeping over many, many years since 1958. A huge commitment here, huge recognition of the work we've done internationally in peacekeeping. But of course, your commentators on this program are right. Everything has changed in relation to the geopolitics of our world. And in a changing context in relation to Russia and indeed America, I think there is a new debate in Ireland in relation to neutrality. Even if you see the way the debate is going now, wanting to take away this triple lock where you have to get, even for peacekeeping, obviously, the approval of the UN, the Dáil, and the government, the cabinet. There's a big debate around that. The government say they're bringing in legislation to change that, to have more flexibility, because we don't want Russia, for example, vetoing peacekeeping. We're also investing more. We've had new reports. Indeed, Admiral Mark Mellett was involved in these, reviews and examining the defence forces, increased budget. And I think now we talk about, which we didn't really speak about before, we're not neutral about values. We're not neutral about which side we're on in relation to Ukraine, and we're not neutral, in relation to these issues. We know what side we're on, but of course we're militarily neutral.
Thank you, Francis. That's a brilliant analysis as ever from you. Mark, just to pick up on one phrase Francis used there, the world has changed. It really has, hasn't it?
It has indeed, but even before the world changed, I have to say I did express my concerns on the question, what did Ireland know that the rest of Europe didn't know, that we could afford to, I suppose, underinvest in our defence forces. I suppose investing in defence is like an insurance policy, and the level of that investment is related to the risk. I can say, over the decades in the past, maybe the risk was not as high as it is today, but things have changed dramatically. But I do think that we need to look back at, I suppose, where we've come from. What's past is prologue, and we've come from a reality that when our state was founded, we were a new fledgling state, and under Article 6 of the Treaty of Independence, our maritime and coastal defence was underwritten by the UK. In fact, it provided that it would be guaranteed by the UK, and in many ways, that became baked into our institutions. And over the decades, and even when I joined the Navy over 50 years ago, I kept on articulating, why are we not investing more in our maritime and our air? And the reality was that the threat was not visible. But what has changed in recent times now is that we are, whether we like it or not, in a hybrid war. We're involved in a hybrid war with the Russian Federation that is challenging us on many fronts. In terms of cyberspace, it's challenging us on our critical infrastructure, in particular in the maritime, our interconnectors, our communications cables. So all bets are off. We're in a new domain now, and I think it is time that we began to actually crank it up in terms of investment in defence. And by the way, that's what's happening. Since 2021, we've increased our defence spending by 45%. And so institutions change in small steps. Rome wasn't built in a day. We don't need to have, I suppose, a rush to spend without building the necessary personnel capabilities that are required, that have to go with that investment in capabilities. And I'm quite certain that's what's happening within our defence forces and also within government.
Thank you very much, Mark. Frank, to you, just on the money side of things, I see the Irish government's allocation this year somewhere in the region of €1.35 billion on defence. That was last year's spend, a little bit more this year. If you look at Poland, Poland is spending 4.8% of its GDP on defence this coming year. That's $45 billion. Now, clearly, they're very, very close to Russia and they have a very sore and painful past and history there. Do you think Ireland's getting a free ride in terms of defence?
Well, that was what I was striking at with that term, benign reliance. The other way of looking at it is indeed a free ride. I think a really good comparator, actually, and I'll just perhaps inject a little bit of perhaps more controversial history. Of all the small nations of Europe, only one small nation, I think, rivals Ireland in its military tradition, and that's Finland. And that was the example I was raising before on the other end of Europe. It has the same population as Ireland, very similar military tradition, or often subordinate to neighbouring powers. And it has a defence budget, I just made a note before, of just under 7 billion euros, which is obviously 5 or 6 times Ireland's. Now, notwithstanding the fact that Finland has also had a very long tradition of neutrality, it does, of course, share a long border, but there are other historical elements there. And I think that's the kind of model that Ireland should be looking at in terms of its level of investment. And one thing that's, I think, very observable over the last couple of years is not so much the nature of the discussion, but its pace. It's very leisurely. We had the defence policy paper last year, and by the way, absent the Admiral from this, followed his work for a while. But the leisurely pace of discussion and advance. My particular expertise is in air power and air defence. And I've noticed that over the last 2 years, notwithstanding a couple of mentions last year, that's moved nowhere. And I think there are options on the table that would be, for which the door is open, that could be actioned over a very short period of time to provide secure air defence using that very big neighbour. And the door is always open on the part of the UK to Ireland for very close cooperation there, certainly in the air domain, and I'm absolutely certain as well also in the naval domain.
Thank you, Frank. Fabrice, let's just say it then. Frank mentioned Finland, who joined NATO alongside Sweden. Do you think the time has come for the Irish to start having that conversation as well?
I don't know if it should be about joining NATO, but clearly there are many shades of grey when it comes to how a country like Ireland, but also Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Austria, define their neutrality. Look at Switzerland, which since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia has actually aligned quite closely with the EU sanctions on Russia, which was not the case 10 years ago. So I think there are ways to kind of redefine neutrality without giving up on neutrality. But what is clear is Ireland also has a responsibility. It is at the node of intersection in subsea cables between North America and Europe, and it cannot just rely on its neighbors to take care of this responsibility. And I think there are also things that are fairly, I would say, non-offensive to do in military terms. I think you will expect from Ireland to be able to exert proper surveillance of its maritime and air domain, given its geographic position. And if you look at Japan, for example, also a country that has constitutional restriction on its armed forces, it has still a quite formidable navy. I'm not saying Ireland should become Japan in Europe, but I'm saying you can go quite a long way and still claiming the notion of being neutral.
Francis, just pick up on some of the issues Frank raised there. Just the relationship with the United Kingdom. For anyone watching around the world, Ireland has a long and very difficult history as a colony of the United Kingdom, and that has been quite a stressful relationship at times. Let's just move on from that, but let's just state it. Francis, I think for a lot of Irish people to hear that we would be reliant on the Royal Air Force policing our skies if there were an issue, come in on your thoughts on that.
Well, look, here's my thoughts on this whole discussion. The truth is that defence, of course, for obvious reasons, was not a priority in public policy making in Ireland in any way. There is an absolutely changed added demand around this debate now for obvious reasons. I mean, all you have to do is look at the attitude, for example, of Germany to Russia and gas, and trying to have friendly trade with them, and you see where that's got us now. I mean, you have a completely it changed. I mean, there's always been tensions, of course, and Cold War and so on. But, this completely new, demanding, challenging geopolitical situation, notwithstanding what we know about misinformation and disinformation in Russia and China and what they've been up to all along, there is an absolute new awareness in Ireland about these threats, the cybersecurity threats, as I said, the threats to our cables, our reliance. I mean, of course, I do agree that the Navy, the potential role of the Navy, we should have been developed. In fact, I was defence spokesperson many, many years ago and made strong recommendations about expanding our naval service, not least to deal with smuggling issues and fishing rights. So, I mean, I think the criticisms have to be very much seen in the historical context, the new situation, an absolute it might sound weak to say it, but emotional attachment to neutrality. But actually, let me just say to you, we have the presidency coming up now of the EU. I was in Copenhagen a few weeks ago. I saw what they were relying on from other countries to make sure that they would have the proper security. This is going to test us. And I think we're going to have far more alliance, for example, Frank is right, with the UK. And by the way, we have a good relationship with the UK now, actually, in a whole range of areas.
Thanks, Francis. Mark, 75% of the underwater cables, undersea cables that go from North America to Europe pass through Irish waters. We've seen Russian ships hovering and loitering off our coast for no good reason. How concerned are you that if there were to be some sort of a hybrid attack, that this could happen in Irish waters?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually over 80%, and there's about 1 trillion euros of trade done every day through those cables. But I am concerned. It is a reality of this new reality we find with this hybrid warfare. And we can see what the Russian Federation has been doing in terms of the Yantar and other, I suppose, grey vessels operating within our jurisdiction. I couldn't agree more with Frank. If you look at Finland, Finland is the gold standard. It is the country that has, I think, in many ways led, not just in terms of capability, but in terms of institutions. It has looked at defence and security not from a siloed effect of a Department of Defence. It has looked at it from a whole of society, whereby every institution, every part of economics, every part of the political system, all of the government departments, and civil society itself, as well as industry, is part of the ability to respond. And that's where Finland is getting it right. It's got a very good defence industry. It's got certainly a very good, I suppose, integrated approach to defence and security with its whole of society approach. And in fact, its current Secretary of Defence, Esa Pulkkinen, General Esa Pulkkinen, who was former the Director General of the EU military staff, sat on our Commission on Defence, and he gave very good advice on our Commission on the Defence Forces that has fed into our now aspirational levels of ambition, which I hope will move to a level of ambition 3. Coming back to the issue of the second point, I think that was made by Frank, was the issue of collaboration. I couldn't agree more with that. The simple reality in today's world, no country, no matter how much it spends, will have all the capabilities necessary to respond to the diverse, I suppose, myriad of threats it will face. You need to have those capabilities spread across space, cyber, land, maritime, and in particular, you need a very strong intelligence network that actually is robust and integrated. I've said in the past, Ireland needs to improve its bilateral and codify, I think in a more credible manner, its bilateral relationships with its nearest European neighbour, that's the UK. But it also needs to do it with its nearest EU neighbour, which is France, and by the way, with its nearest transatlantic neighbour, the US. This is a collaborative multilateral requirement in terms of defence and security today. That doesn't mean that you're ceding neutrality. You can still retain the sovereign function with regards to how your forces are deployed at a national level.
Fabrice, just on that issue of geography, Ireland on the western edges of Europe, do you think geography has maybe influenced Irish thinking? We're so far away from anyone we previously thought of as hostile, but the world has changed, as Francis pointed out. It's getting smaller, and we're seeing Russian submarines pop up off the coast of Scotland, for example. We're seeing shadow fleet vessels taking an interest in cables off the UK and Ireland. Do you think geography perhaps previously influenced Irish government thinking?
Certainly, but the reality is that geography also comes back with a vengeance. And this is what we have seen with the Russian maritime activities around Ireland. So I think it's time to reconsider geography, because geography changes with political international circumstances. And I will add this, I do think Ireland, again, has this special responsibility, but can also play by its strengths. For example, I think Ireland, both the maritime and the space domains, are probably the most important things it can get right. And these are actually not necessarily offensive military posture. These are more like about surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance, the things that really make a difference to the overall posture of the European allies. And here, I think Ireland could develop, for example, a space-based sector of satellite companies that can give Ireland, and by extent, the European partners and allies, much greater visibility over activities in very large areas, maritime areas, which is really the critical thing to do.
Thank you, Fabrice. Francis, to you, you served in government for so long in Ireland. We all know that when there's an election, defence does not really get mentioned in the conversation. It's always jobs, healthcare, housing. Is that a calculation by Irish politicians that they don't really need to talk about defence much because Irish people are not interested?
Well, you will remember it came up during the Nice Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, where we got special guarantees in relation to neutrality. There was so much scaremongering about a European army. But, really, speaking frankly, I mean, defence has not in any way been central to policy making in Ireland. That has changed. And I would say to my colleagues, on the programme from London and Spain, that has changed. The debate, the discussion is changing, has changed in Ireland. You will see it changing in relation to the presidency, the awareness. I mean, you talked about the Russian ships off the coast of Scotland, off the coast of Ireland. I mean, it's just our world has gotten so much smaller. The threats are so much more imminent and near. That is changing the understanding. And I absolutely see that we will move much more towards, greater affiliation, closer cooperation, and so on. And that people will see the imperative of having to defend ourselves on our seas and so on, as we've been discussing. So, I mean, this is a policy that was peripheral, that has moved much more centre stage with the greater awareness, the greater threats, the geopolitical threats. And I think, you couldn't talk about this before. I mean, this was an area that if anybody mentioned it, there was absolute uproar. That's changing. And for obvious reasons, very sensible, obvious reasons at present, sadly, because of the aggression that we're seeing. Who thought our world would be exactly where it is today and we'd have that level of threat? And now Irish neutrality has to be put in that context.
Thank you, Francis. Mark, just as we near the end of the conversation, I want to bring into the mix the prospect of a Sinn Féin government in Ireland. So for an international audience watching in, this is a Republican Party that wants a united Ireland. They are very much against NATO and they are very pro-Irish neutrality. Does that concern you that if Sinn Féin in 5 or 10 years' time were to get into power, that they would have a very big say in how Ireland's defence unfolds?
I think there's a fundamental elephant in the room. For Russia to become stronger, all that needs to happen is Europe to become weaker. And so there's a critical requirement for us to look at the values that we share between the UK, EU, and other European states and consolidate. We are on the same page. So therefore, in terms of the institutions, international human rights, International Court of Justice, and so on, with regards to the imperative to uphold sovereignty, we need to have a collective view. So Clausewitz said there can be no other way except to subordinate the military to the political. But I will still say, at the end of the day, the sovereign rights that are not upheld are more imaginary than real. I go back to my point earlier that there is an onus on us all as a collective to uphold our own sovereignty and to actually play our part in terms of securing the sovereignty and sovereign rights of our partners and our neighbours. I would also make the point that multilateralism is the framework in which that happens. And so going to civil society, Sinn Féin government or any coalition that might exist into the future, there is an onus on a leadership piece there, but there is also a bottom-up piece with regards to society and citizens to ensure whatever government they put in is going to look after the interests of their state and their values and the future for their children. So that's a leadership piece for a future government. And just come back to Fabrice's point on space, he's absolutely right. Defence doesn't need to be just a cost centre. Defence can be an investment centre. In fact, it could be a profit centre for economies. Ireland has some wonderful companies in the space domain. It has some wonderful companies in the tech domain. And I think what we need to do is look at how we actually marshal those together to develop a defence industry that contributes to the collective of the European neighbours.
Frank, Fabrice, Mark in Cork and Francis Fitzgerald in Dublin, thank you all so much for your analysis on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.